So my journey into discovering Zora Neale Hurston, I would consider it a wild adventure. In my 10th or 11th grade class, I was assigned Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I actually did not read the book. The book was put in front of me, but nobody told me anything about the amazing woman who wrote the book, the things she accomplished, such as being a trained anthropologist in 1928, being a 2-time Guggenheim Fellow, traveling to Jamaica and Haiti to study original African spiritual practices such as voodoo, and even things like folklore and children's games. Did not read the book, still got an A on the essay because I asked my sister, who was an avid reader, to provide me the Cliff Notes version of the book. Fast forward to 2018, I was living life as a published children's author and designing children's programming at the time. And I had a partnership with Michigan State University's Residential College in the Arts and Humanities. The professor who oversaw that partnership, he said, "You're good with the kids, you're good with my college students, why don't you present for our Black History series?" And so at first I said, "Well, what do you want me to present about?" And he said, "The person from Black history who has most inspired your career as a writer." And because I did not like to read as a child, I didn't have anybody. But he told me, he said, "I will pay you an honorarium." And so from that moment, I decided I will find someone. I decided to do the presentation on Langston Hughes because I figured I could brush up on some poetry pretty quickly. I did love the fact that Langston Hughes used simple, everyday language, and he was focused on the working class Black man in his works. I figured I could come up with something pretty quickly, but as I started researching Langston Hughes, I was devastated to find that I did not feel a personal connection with him. And in addition, this lady kept popping up named Zora Neale Hurston, and I thought to myself, oh yeah, the lady who wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God, the book that I didn't read in high school. But I was surprised to find that Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes were friends during the Harlem Renaissance, and that she was a part of the Harlem Renaissance at all. I decided to tack Zora onto my presentation, but all the while, every time I said, "and Zora," I felt this sensation come over me that was much filled with regret that I was not presenting solely on Zora. And from that moment, I decided if I ever had a chance to do another Black history presentation, Zora would be the star of my show, and she has been since that day. The thing that led me to become a Zora Neale Hurston scholar, that is not a title that I gave myself. My journey into learning about, researching, and loving Zora started with that presentation, and I said, it's a shame that I didn't know more about Zora Neale Hurston, and so it was a personal journey to learn more about her, and it was a spontaneous thing that changed my life. Once she puts her hooks in you, she often doesn't let go. She is never short on fascination, on intrigue, and on sass. And so a woman who lived from 1891 to 1960, who still exists as one of the greatest writers of all time, I mean, I couldn't let go. Zora Neale Hurston has changed every corner of my life. When I started presenting on Zora, one of the things that I had never really expressed out loud was my desire to write full-length novel manuscripts. I wanted to be a novelist, I wanted to be a folklorist, but I didn't have the confidence to believe that I could actually do it. And it's probably based in the ideology that I didn't know what it looked like to be a person who did do that. Zora gave me the gift of her personal letters, a collection edited by Carla Kaplan, and Zora Neale Hurston, A Life in Letters. And it's 84 letters written by Zora to her contemporaries, her friends, colleagues, even her publisher and her literary agent. And along the way, I was able to see that even Zora herself, all the works that she published, she was never satisfied with them. But she was able to express how she felt about her journey, the truth about it, some of those behind the scenes hard things she had to overcome, and how she still persisted. And so from that moment, I did realize that I could do it too, and it's thanks to Zora. And so now this year, my book, Dear Zora, is coming out, and I've even written a full-length YA novel manuscript. Zora inspires every bit of my work. So even if I write something or I do something, and Zora's name is not in the title, she's always a big part of the inspiration and encouragement to actually get it done. Zora herself wrote across many different genres. She was a playwright, folklorist, novelist, essayist, journalist. And so knowing that, it has given me the freedom to also try to tell stories across different genres. Unlike any other contemporary from the Harlem Renaissance, Zora Neale Hurston was the only person to be raised in the first all-Black incorporated municipality in the history of the United States. It gave her a very unique upbringing and outlook on life. So she often was at odds with figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Charles S. Johnson of the Urban League, even James Weldon Johnson. Her outlook was that Black people were artists themselves, that they were worthy of being looked at as authentic humans. And so the stereotypical view, the self-loathing view that Black people needed to assimilate into white culture to be considered worthy, Zora challenged that at every go. And because of that, organizations such as the NAACP and Urban League often outcast her and tried to discourage the way that she presented her texts, such as Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is a story about the interior life of a Black woman, which was written in 1937. The Harlem Renaissance is a significant period to Zora Neale Hurston because it's where she got her start in the literary arts. She was a contemporary of Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, Richard Wright, but at that time, Countee Cullen, Dorothy West, Claude McKay, Wallace Thurman. And so the people that we celebrate now, Zora should be one of them, unfortunately. When we talk about her career, her most prolific period was actually during the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, she put out the great majority of her books. She published Muse and Men in 1933, Jonas Gordvine in 1934, Tell My Horse, I think, was 1936 or 37, Their Eyes Were Watching God, 1937. And then Zora kept publishing. She was doing field work. She was traveling to Jamaica and Haiti as a Guggenheim Fellow to collect original African processes, practices, and religious beliefs. Zora was prolific during the Great Depression. At a time when other Harlem Renaissance contemporaries were trying to showcase the racist status of America, Zora was focused on the wholeness, the multi-layered humanness of Black people. When the Talented Tenth and the New Negro was the movement that existed during the Harlem Renaissance, and artists such as Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes were used to exhibit that by political organizations such as the NAACP and Urban League. Zora did something different. She said, "I'm a proud Southern woman who knows the rich history and heritage of the everyday folk who you guys are trying to disassociate with." And so it made her very different because she was the only person from the South during the Harlem Renaissance. She was the only person who was raised in an all-Black incorporated municipality. And she felt a strong race pride in who Black people naturally were. She didn't feel the need for us to be buttoned up, for us to be Black Victorians, for us to go to Harvard. She said, as we are, the ways that we live is beautiful, and someone ought to write stories of characters who showcase us in our fullness, and someone ought to be preserving it, and she decided to do that. I actually recommend that people read Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick, which is a collection of short stories by Zora Neale Hurston, first, because it gives a wide variety of the subjects Zora wanted to focus on. Oftentimes, we consider her characters such as Janie Crawford from Their Eyes Were Watching God, John from Jonas Gordvine, and even Moses Man on the Mountain. We consider these everyday folk people that Zora wanted to tell the stories about. But Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick actually challenges what we know about the Zora canon, I would call it, and what she was focused on. In those books, those short stories, she talks about reverse migration, divorce. She showcases life of Black people up north, but she also is a story in there that's my favorite short story, Drenched in Light, where she creates this autobiography of herself as a child and what her life was like in Eatonville with a grandmother who wanted to squash and squelch her precocious spirit. And so that gives the widest experience, I think, firsthand with Zora's great breadth of ideologies. Drenched in Light is my absolute favorite short story of all times. Isis Watts is a precocious little girl who is Zora, and I can relate a lot to that. I had a grandmother who did not like my precocious spirit, and so I think that that story touches me on a personal level. My favorite book is actually Jonah's Gourdvine because it's basically a biography of her father's life. And her father, John Hurston, was really big in the town of Eatonville because he helped write the town's laws and he was mayor 3 different times. And if you read Jonah's Gourdvine, you'll be able to find some of those facts about Zora's father and her family within them. That is my favorite book by Zora. If you love Zora, you of course have to visit Eatonville, Florida. The Zora Neale Hurston Museum of Fine Arts is here. You have the Eatonville Branch Library, who is doing some great programming around Zora Neale Hurston and growing and working to share her legacy in creative ways. And then I absolutely recommend that people go to Fort Pierce. The Dust Tracks Heritage Trail holds many sites relevant to Zora's life and her career, such as her grave site. Even Beanie Backus's house. He was a landscape artist, one of the most famous landscape artists from Florida, but he housed a lot of artists and he would have music sessions, which Zora attended. You have her last residence, which was 1734 School Court, and it's right across from Lincoln Park Academy, where Zora was an English teacher. That was her last job. But the Dust Tracks Heritage Trail in Fort Pierce even has her grave site. And they have beautiful kiosks that actually show you the information about the sites so that you can learn more. One of the things that Zora did that I think was ingenious is that she focused on the human experience, multi-layered characters, multi-layered issues that still affect us today. One of the essays that she wrote is what white publishers won't print. And she talks about the censorship that exists because publishers traditionally have focused on white audiences and white readers. And so even today, 100 years later, there's still a lack of diversity in publishing. And I think that's one of the things about Zora that makes her live on forever. Her subject matter, her focus, her human connection is just timeless. Something I knew everyone knew about Zora Neale Hurston, I wish that they could assess the origins of why she did things. When we look at Zora's personality, she is infamous for a lot of things, such as opposing 1954 Brown versus Board, which was integrating schools. I wish that they understood how much pride and love she had for her people and how that impacted her work and her outlook, her politics as well. And so when we start to decode that with her love of her people, I think that it helps us understand and value her opinions and her work much more. There are a lot of misconceptions about Zora. A lot of times people will say, oh, well, she was a conservative. And so when we look at the social and political context of the time that Zora lived in, for instance, communism was something that you could be blackballed for, if not worse. And so she openly detested communism. But people will say, oh, Zora was a conservative. And really, she wasn't a conservative. Her politics were based on her pride for her people. So she said, okay, well, I don't want to support someone who's pandering to Black people for votes in a public, but then I know who they are behind closed doors. And you wonder, okay, well, did Zora really know who people were behind closed doors? And she absolutely did. Even in 1918, in the early 1920s, when she was attending Howard University, Zora worked in a Black manicure shop, and I think it was actually a Black barbershop that only served white clients and high-end white clientele. And a lot of Zora's clients as a manicurist were politicians or people who worked in Washington, D.C. So even at that young age, she had access to know what was going on in the country before it was happening. In addition, another misconception is that the Harlem Renaissance was an artistic movement and solely artistic movement. But the truth was that it was funded by political organizations such as the NAACP and the Urban League. Zora in 1925 made her arrival on the scene of Harlem because she won awards for the Opportunity magazine competition. And the Opportunity magazine was the literary journal from the Urban League. And so Zora was oftentimes in rooms with these thought leaders and politicians and privy to their motives and who they were behind closed doors. I think misunderstanding her politics is probably the biggest misconception about her. So when Zora was 13, her mother died. And Lucy Hurston was her champion. So Lucy Hurston told all of her children, 8 of them, to jump at the sun, because even if they didn't reach the sun, they would at least get off the ground. But with Zora's precocious spirit, her father and her grandmother often tried to beat the spirit out of her. They had a large fear and reminder that her father and her grandmother were both born into slavery. And so being born in Alabama, her father and her grandmother had a great fear of how white people would respond to Zora's big personality. And so they tried to manage it at home. Well, Lucy Hurston countered that, and she protected Zora, she championed her, and she let her be exactly who she was. When Zora was 13, Lucy passed away, and all the protection she had from her mother went with it. Her father even sent her away to boarding school with her older sister, Sarah, who was born 15 months before her, and she was Sarah was actually John's favorite, and he was her baby girl. But because he had one baby girl and he didn't see the value in women, he didn't need another one. So when Zora came along, he was like, well, what's the point of her? He sent Zora to boarding school with Sarah and then her other older brother, John. While at boarding school, 5 months after Lucy passed away, John remarried a woman who was 20 years old named Maddie Modge. Maddie Modge absolutely just wanted to take all of John's money. So she said, oh, you shouldn't pay for your children to go to school anymore. Sarah, who was John's favorite, was so heartbroken the way that John treated her as a result of Maddie's direction. She was brokenhearted. She left school, remarried, and moved to Baltimore with a man named John Mack. Zora, with her big spirit, decided to fight her stepmother. And it was a knockout, drag-out fight right here in Eatonville, Florida, so much so that neighbors had to come and pull Zora off of her stepmother. Zora said herself she fully intended to kill her. After that, John disowned Zora. He stopped paying for her to go to school. He told the school they could adopt her. That started Zora's years of wandering. She stayed with different family members and different neighbors right here in Eatonville, and eventually staying with John, her older brother, and with Bob, her oldest brother. Bob decided that he would tell Zora he would help her get back into school to finish high school. He did not. Instead, he had her help with his children and help his wife run the household. Zora fled to go live with her brother John and his wife Blanche. And with John and Blanche, Zora had a very interesting life because Blanche was a florist. Blanche actually taught Zora lots of her knowledge about flowers, and throughout her life, she always loved them. But John still did not help Zora go back to school. So she decided to go to Baltimore. And in Baltimore, she became a lady's maid for the lead singer of the Gilbert and Sullivan Troupe. The Gilbert and Sullivan Troupe is where Zora got her love for theater and for music. Now, while there, her employer, the lead singer of the Gilbert and Sullivan Troupe, decided to get married. And that means that Zora was unemployed, and Zora wanted to go back to school. She found out that she could go to school for free if she was a minor. By this point, Zora was 26. She told them she was 16. They believed her, and Zora was able to finish school. She went to Morgan Academy to finish her high school. I think that the Eatonville Branch Library is so important, not just for the community, but to Zora's legacy. One of the things that Zora experienced throughout her life is the tradition of Black women being domestic workers and the feeling of fighting against that. And so oftentimes she was fired because she was found in her white employers' libraries, their home libraries, trying to read. One of the things Zora always talked about in many of her stories, even in her autobiography, is sitting on the gateposts outside of her home here in Eatonville, and she would watch the cars drive by, and more times than not, they would be white drivers on their way through Eatonville to Orlando, and she would ask them to go a piece of the way for her. or she would ask them if she could go a piece of the way with them. And she would tell them stories and they would give her things like books. She always loved to read. And so keeping that legacy and that heritage going and building the love of reading in the community, the library is the best place to do that.